Hello, and welcome to another episode of Healing Spaces, Mental Health Design Dialogue, where we delve into issues and topics that are shaping the world of mental health design. My name is Lotte Bailey, and I am Pineapple's Customer Insights Manager. And today I am joined by two mental health lived experience experts who have both used their own circumstances and recovery journeys to help designers create more effective and compassionate solutions for the built environment. We have Hannah Chamberlain, mental health design consultant and previous CEO of Design and Mental Health, and Joe Bourdain, interior architect, artist and lived experience advisor. You can find out more about both of them on our podcast page. Hannah, let's jump right in. When you talk about the lived experience, what exactly are you referring to?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be here. I do think lived experience is something that is really intrinsic to someone who's experienced it. It's difficult to categorize with a sort of straight line to say one person has lived experience and one person doesn't. It used to be that mental health was very much a ghetto. And if you felt stigmatized by your mental health, then you were in that ghetto. And otherwise you were sort of part of mainstream society. I think as stigma has dissolved a little bit, then the term lived experience has changed. But when it comes to design, it's about that experience of the change of identity that happens when you go into a building that you are using as a service user and how you relate to a building as a service user. So that's how we defined it when I was working for Design and Mental Health Network, was that it's about experiencing that identity shift, which is a legal one, which is to do with your freedom, which is to do with your whole kind of relationship to society. And that's how I would define lived experience.
Thank you. And Joe, what does the lived experience mean to you? And how do you apply it now in the design industry?
Thanks, Lotte. It's lovely to be with both of you this morning. So I think I'll build on what Hannah said. I think lived experience, or this word lived experience, often sits inside the framework of quality improvement. And so that improvement could be, well, we're talking specifically about healthcare, but that improvement could be for a service, for a product inside a service, for the building itself. And so lived experience is your interaction with that, and kind of how you identify going through the world, whether you have different kinds of mobility issues, whether you live with the diagnosis, whether all of the ways in which you experience the world, and then how that qualifies you to give feedback on that area of life, and how that can then be used to leverage change and improvement into the future. And that's why you would share your lived experience. And then I think what Hannah said is really vital around the kind of feedback that you're giving if you have been in a hospital, especially around like losing agency and stuff like that. I think perhaps an example that really strikes home for me is when I was in a mental health hospital for the first time. It was while I was studying architecture, and I was spending a lot of my time during the day learning about how you create a space and how it feels and how you make a space feel a certain way. And there was an example which has stuck with me. A lecturer was talking about going into a McDonald's and what makes a McDonald's a McDonald's. So we have very bright lights. They're very high up in the ceiling. We have hard surfaces that are easy to clean. They're quite high up. Seating's quite high up. It's hard. And so there's really these like small environmental cues tell you to be there, to do what you need to do, and to get out. It doesn't have that warm atmosphere, that comfortable atmosphere of linger longer. And I think when I was in hospital and I was there for an extended period of time, you'd expect a space where you're staying to kind of have those environmental cues that you are welcome, that you can stay here longer, that this is a place to heal. But it very much reminded me a lot more of a McDonald's, get in, get out. And in that moment, there's a juxtaposition between what you're being told you're there for and the way that your body is reacting to the environment. And this is something that I unpacked much later on when I started to give feedback around the design of hospitals. Because even as a designer, even if you understand it, it doesn't stop it from happening to you. And so I think therein lies the element of having that lived experience does drastically shift the way that you start looking at these simple designed elements in your environment, like a door handle, like a chair, because compounded, they have very strong impact on the way you interact with the space and the people around you.
Can I jump in there? Because I think the lived experience angle, that's a really interesting point about McDonald's, Jo, and I'd not thought about in that kind of way. I think that the power architecture and the little details that tell you who you are in the building give you that sense of who the building is designed for. And so often in mental health units, it's not designed for the end user. It's designed for the convenience of the staff. And therefore, it's designed as a work environment first, and then a therapeutic environment second. And there are conflicting needs within a mental health unit, and they need to be acknowledged, and staff needs need to be reflected. But at the same time, it creates such a level of conflict within the person who's the patient. So my example would be when I went into a unit for the first time, I was in a room. I was presented with a room and they said, "This is your bedroom." And I said, "No, it's not my bedroom because it doesn't have any of my stuff in it." And then they gave me a form and they said, "Fill it in and tell us who you are." And I looked at the room and there were bars on the windows. It was an old asylum. This was 20, 30 years ago. There were bars on the windows. And I said, "I cannot tell you who I am in this room because the whole room is telling me who I am. If you take me outside this building and I sit on a bench and, wrap me in a blanket, I'm not going to run away, but I can't tell you who I am inside this building because there's too much conflict going on in my head about that." So in order to move beyond the identity threat and the whole survival threat and the threat to freedom that mental health units represent, you need design cues that help you feel comfortable with yourself. And even though hopefully there's no institutions in the UK with bars on the windows anymore, but those little cues will tell you who you are, the role that you're expected to play in relation to the building. And if you are conflicted in your head about who I am here and the different messages I get, it makes that message of healing and therapy that much harder to get through. And remember, if you are certainly in psychosis, you pick up on lots of cues, lots of subconscious cues, lots of conscious cues, but subconscious cues that are in the environment, and you're just really super sensitive.
Thank you, Anna. And can I ask, what are some of the common misconceptions about mental health that you have encountered in the design industry from your own experiences?
I think that the most common misconception that we're still designing mental health units around is that people with a mental health condition are necessarily violent. We should have got rid of this stigma years ago, and yet we haven't. And so therefore we design mental health units with the idea of pacifying people, with the idea that they will be a risk or a threat, and not considering how sort of what the building is doing to them, what the experience is doing to them, and the threats to sense of self that they are experiencing that may cause elements of just distress that come out in an aggravated way. If we can sit alongside people and be much more empathetic, then I think that would make a huge difference. And I can't believe that we're still fighting this fight to get that misconception dropped. Like mental health should be about prevention and empathy and a trauma-informed, empathetic, person-centered understanding. And yet we still are obsessed with violence and risk.
I think I can add to that almost in this aim to make environments calm and passive so that there is fewer risks, it almost has the adverse effect. So now we're painting places without any color. It's all white, it's all magnolia, it's all just supposed to be very neutral and very calm so that it doesn't upset anyone, that it doesn't trigger anything. And instead, you feel patronized and you feel you've got nothing to engage with, nothing to give you hope, nothing to spark a conversation, nothing to make you feel human. And I think it almost has the opposite effect in many, many ways. And unfortunately, Hannah, like I've been in a mental health hospital within the last 5 years, and there were bars on the window, and there was peeling paint, and so it's very much work that we still need to be doing and fighting for, because I think it's that exact same going into this therapeutic environment where the built environment is telling you to give up on yourself and on your care. And that is a very strong message that we need to be moving past. And I think, Lotte, to your point around what are some of the misconceptions, I think when it comes to design, we often know, or as designers, the process to design something is to speak to the end user, to find feedback, to make something better and improve it. And that's where quality improvement comes in and lived experience comes in. But there's this huge fear not to talk to people with lived experience. That there's this, you can't actually talk to the mentally ill, that they're either not capable or not competent or won't actually know their own mind, or that it's too hard to go through the red tape to speak to people with mental health conditions. And that's simply not true, because who's better to help you than yourself often? And that there's an incredible amount of empowerment in going that you've gone through this experience, and instead of just being subject to that or having something designed for you, that actually this is a point in which we get to shift that dynamic and go, what worked for you? What didn't work for you? You didn't have any say in this. Now let's actually return some agency. And that in itself can be a deeply healing process, taking that back and paying that forward, knowing that you're contributing to make sure that somebody else's experience of that environment is not going to be the same as your own.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We talk at Pineapple a lot about the concept of my home is my castle, and the sense of esteem that can be created in having autonomy over your environment. And as you say, how that can contribute to a sense of healing. I think it's really important to acknowledge. Thank you.
I think coming back on that point about the my home is my castle, I think there's a sort of element of this is a home temporarily, but it's got to feel like that temporary space that you go through. And what's interesting about, it like a hospital occupies a unique place in the kind of role that it plays, in that it's not a domestic environment. It's probably closest, I would really like to think of it as being closest to a university, like university halls or something like that. And you'd hope that you learn something, that you grow, that you form relationships, and that you come out of it a kind of better person. But you're bearing in mind that there's a temporary element, there's a temporary relationship to where you are. And I think that where buildings get stuck is or kind of trap people, give them a fixed identity. Because in a hospital, you only enter the hospital if you're a service user, staff, or a visitor. So how do you move through and past that relationship to the building, where if you're defined as a service user, you don't get stuck as a service user? In some ways, I think a university hall is a good way to think of it, that kind of element where you want to be able to personalize, but you are aware that you're also passing it on to the next group, and you're hoping for those good relationships. I'd really like to think that we could develop that kind of a relationship to a hospital, where it's a learning experience for everyone, not just for the patient, but for the staff and so on. So that'd be a really progressive vision of the role of a hospital.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Hannah.
I really love that point, that we need to be viewing hospitals as a temporary space. And so that it is, yes, you're going there actually in a moment of crisis, because your medical help in the community, your social help within the community has either failed or not been there. And so now you're in hospital, and that needs to be as therapeutic of an environment as possible. But it is a crisis. You're not supposed to spend months and years in hospital. You're supposed to get there, get the help that you need, get the equipping that you need to then leave that space and continue with your life. And so I think that idea of going somewhere to be educated and nurtured and then move on is a really helpful way of viewing it.
I saw a fantastic art. It was like an art project intervention called where people sat down in a workshop and they did a mental health CV, and they wrote down, I went to this institution, from this date to this date, a bit like going to school, but I was admitted, from this date to this date, and I spent 3 months or whatever it was, and I learnt, or I did, or I grew in whatever way. And then, and you listed your admissions and you put what you'd learnt. And it was actually quite difficult, but it was a really interesting exercise. And I think if we could think of it as a mental health CV, I mean, prisons do that. They aim for education, that like hospitals are obviously a shorter intervention, but there should be some growth that comes out of it.
I think sometimes what has happened in hospital is it's created more hurt and more harm than anything else. And I think that process is still really important, that debriefing after an experience that can have therapeutic but also harmful elements, and reflecting on that, and then having the support and the encouragement to go back to the designers or the services, the people who are running those services, the organizations, whether that's private or public, and giving the feedback to improve that. And with inside that, that's a lot of activism. It's often to look at the hurt and then to do something towards it. It can be healing for yourself, but it's also a lot of giving of yourself to improve something. And I think that's what, when we're talking about lived experience, that is what we're talking about, is really using that as advocacy. And I echo that it would be so beneficial to have everybody who's gone through these experiences to reflect on that, and to make sure that the next step is in healing themselves and in healing the environment that we use.
And the contribution that you can make is, I mean, you've got to reflect and so on, but that can be a really valuable thing. And also what you've said has made me think about the transition from when you leave hospital, because I think that's a designer's responsibility as well, weirdly, because when I leave hospital, I often find it takes me, if I'm in hospital for 3 months, it will take me a year to recover my authority and identity and sense of self and my kind of continuous sense of narrative that enables me to kind of act with any kind of sort of agency or be employed or do any of those things. And I think that encouraging dependency on an environment is actually a designer's responsibility as well. So you want the environment to work, but you don't want it to work so well that you basically, like, you can't function outside it. So that element of transition is also important to help people think about their next steps.
I think there's such a beautiful role for occupational therapists in that space. Like, I think often they design quiet rooms, and I think there has been a movement away from flashy lights and all of those sort of things that you just wouldn't be able to have again in homes. And sometimes you do need that deeply immersive experience because it is a crisis intervention. So mental health hospitals are an extreme intervention. So it is okay to have extreme measures in the sense of having the best sort of technology and the best sort of things to help you in that space. But then there's also that transition area. And that's why I mentioned occupational therapists, because it's like, how do we create this at home? It's important to have a step to how do you recreate some of those sensory rooms that you've had in hospital that were perhaps really helpful. How can you recreate that at home? But I think what I never want to lean into is going, oh, well, we don't want to make a hospital too nice, or we don't think that people deserve that much space or that much thing. And I'm completely opposed to that, because I think when you've made it to hospital because you're in a place of crisis, like, you deserve all the kindness and all the care. Like, this is the point where we need to be looking after people with as much of our skill set as we can, because this is the breaking point that we can now change society in the other direction. So I think we really do, like, design needs to work with the services. And so I think it is an interdisciplinary field, design.
I've got a definition of good mental health, actually, which you reminded me of, which is: good mental health is an art built on the habit of catching and appreciating ordinary moments. So I think, like, what you're trying to do in a hospital is create ordinary moments out of sort of, extremes of experience, but those ordinary moments of groundedness, which doesn't mean that you can't be in a sensory room to do that. Like, experiencing something wonderful in a sensory room could be amazing, but it's about building that habit of ordinary moments in quite extraordinary places. But how do you connect to yourself, to other people, to your environment, just to get that sense of groundedness? Yeah.
That's beautiful. I love that. And moving on to my next question, looking at the different diverse needs and backgrounds of the people who are in these spaces, how can we create a more inclusive and accessible space for everyone in one building?
Can I say something about co-production on this? Because, like, I think that co-production at the moment, we're not digging into it in the way that we need to. There's more to be done. Those diverse needs and backgrounds, sometimes you have a situation. We did a co-production session at Design and Mental Health Network conference last year, and it was all about how do you get the quieter people in the room, how do you get the people who are facing barriers, how do you get the diversity voices? How do you ensure that they are contributing to co-production? And I think it's really important. The work that we've done on our lived experience panel in the time I was CEO was about creating a diversity of voices. And it's just really, really easy for like the most confidently expressed opinion in the room to be taken as the, you know, as the gospel, or you know, as the kind of, yeah, the dominant opinion. And it's not really the case. We need to do co-production with things like Play-Doh. We need to use Lego. We need to use ways of getting people to feedback that are maybe non-verbal, or give people a chance to feedback after a session by giving them a phone call, or, you know, just find out how people want to contribute, and bear in mind that often people coming out of hospital, and you want the people who are new to lived experience to reflect their views. Often people who've come out of hospital are lacking in confidence, or who've freshly come out of hospital have had a confidence knock, and we really need to be able to listen to those voices as well. It's really important.
Thank you, Hannah. Can I ask you to define what co-production means, please?
Oh, so it's just the process. I mean, I'm picking up on Joe's point of listening to people, but it's the process of working with people, consulting with people. I mean, you know, product manufacturers and designers in commercial spaces use it all the time, but in the NHS and in health, the concept of co-production has come out of the service user movement, and it's moving beyond just listening and consulting into actually co-creating and doing things together. So it's kind of involving people at every stage to give feedback and to create as well, rather than just to consult.
I'll jump in on that. I think in order to have an inclusive and more accessible space, we understand that you need to have a more inclusive and accessible. The right people need to be at the table. So if you want a world designed for all people, then you need to speak to all different kinds of people, which can seem like a very overwhelming task. But the more complexity we have, the less oversight we're going to have, and so the better spaces we're going to have. And I think that's where, you know, quality improvement comes in. That's where involvement comes in. And like Hannah speaking, that there seems to be a spectrum of consulting lived experience and quality improvement. And often it can be, if it's, you know, a line on one side of the spectrum, we have tokenism. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have co-design. And so if you're being brought in at the end of a project and going, what do you think of this? And they go, oh, yeah, that's nice. But actually, is it really nice? Have you had any say in that? And is that then going to be marketed? This chair, this building has this poster, this program has been approved by people with lived experience. And that's very much like a tick box exercise, as opposed to the other end of the spectrum, which is what we're aiming for in co-design, in going, okay, what is this that we are designing? What do we need it to look like? So it's by the people, for the people. And so it's really that. And I think in order to have this inclusive environment, we really do need to be looking at the data of who's going to be using the service, because I think you need to have the right people in the room. So you need to know who's going to be using that and speak to them, because when we're talking about lived experience, we are talking about the lived or living experience of that specific service, that specific product, that specific demographic. And so intersectionality is really important. And so there is a lot of work to be done around recruiting the right people And so there are organizations that do that. And I think if anybody's going into that process, it's finding lived experience, and there are organizations that help do that. There might be people within inside the public or private healthcare system. And then just getting the right people in the room isn't necessarily enough either. So then you need to be looking at the process itself. Are you asking the right questions? Are you listening? Is the space safe to be able to share that sort of experience? And I think that's often why lived experience groups or advisory groups or public and patient involvement, or all of these different words that are used to define a group of people who have lived experience, to share that information, that often facilitating is really important. And so when you have somebody who's sharing their experience and being vulnerable about that it then creates a safer space for others to share their experiences. And so at that point you start to get this gold magic of like, now we have things that are like people are getting to share, and it feels like this really deep moment. But then you're also having these actionable points that can be used to improve something in the future. And then this is like speaking to what Hannah was saying around finding ways that that is natural to be able to express. Like that's going to look very different for different people. And then checking in. So at the end of the process, how did that go for you? What do you need next? How do we do this better in the future? I think it is this constant feedback loop. And so moving towards co-production is definitely how we create a more inclusive and accessible environment. And there's something to be said about just like we all have mental health. Not all of us are struggling with mental illness. All of us have sight health. Like we all, some of us are looking at different things. And so if you design a walkway that has very clear lines, that you have good depth perception between different things, so you don't think that there's a step where there isn't a step, and moments like that. Now that's crucial for people with dementia, with people with sight impairments, but it's healthy for all of our eye health will benefit from that. And so there really is, if we design for the extremes, we really will be having a catchment area of all of us. And so we need to stop viewing it as, oh, we have too many conflicting moments of these extremes and we can't make it for everyone. But actually realizing by incorporating those outliers, we actually are making it more inclusive for everyone.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, all those in accessibility things that have been worked into public transport, for example, like the announcement of the stop, and the fact that when you're on the tube, then the train stop comes up in a light up sign. Now that was designed for people with disabilities, but it's inclusive for everyone, and people rely on it all the time. So, but I completely agree with designing for outliers. I think it's absolutely the way to go. And the other thing to say is that co-production isn't a one-off. Often we start with something. I sometimes I don't think we start co-production early off enough in the process. And there's a design practice called jobs to be done, where you get people together and you work out, first of all, what is this building going to do, but actually, like, what role does it play in your life? And you start with those kind of, what would you want it to do for you? Coming back, just rewinding the process as early as possible as you can. And often people will have co-production sessions in a hospital, in the boardroom or whatever, and then and they're designing in the building where they're going to replace, and then they're amazed when they come up with an identikit of the building that they were co-producing in. It's just ridiculous. Why don't we take it completely out at the beginning. And also you need to co-produce throughout the process so that you are working with people, finding out their ideas, and then iterating something, then bringing it back to them, and iterating again. I always think co-production is really great when it's facilitated by someone with lived experience rather than by staff solely or by architects solely. That sort of I get you is where you start.
Thank you, Hannah. Well, that certainly does give us a lot to think about, and I want to thank you both for your insights and thoughtful contributions to this discussion. Hopefully we'll see you again on Healing Spaces. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. Please do make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next episode.